Yeah, so this podcast was supposed to be about, or is about, how strong do you need to be to compete in CrossFit. We have the beginning of the year starting, which is normally our open prep cycle. It's getting ready for the season. So I think an important thing for people to set markers and barometers for. Now it's getting into the top 25%, but like when we ran some of the data, it was more towards the top 10% and being competitive to get into quarterfinals, what the elite level strength is. And we're going to talk about just some of the nuance of strength development in the sport, because I think it's different than a lot of experts in the strength world will talk about strength a lot and recommendations for what people in the CrossFit sphere should do. But having experience in there, there's like, you got to take some of the stuff from the strength world and from the academic world and the research world, but when you start applying it in a CrossFit setting, it's a little bit more broad and complicated.
There's a lot more nuance to it. I think that's the reality, is because CrossFit doesn't just test strength as simply as 1RMs, right? Now you've opened up this whole, spectrum of strength that needs to be trained. And, I think the question of how strong do you need to be to compete in CrossFit, it's a really complicated question that have so many layers of qualifiers, but we'll try and keep it as simple as possible here, I think.
I used to think you had to be really strong. Like I thought like that was the metric. And then it was like, you just need to be strong enough. Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay. So like, what is that strong enough metric? And like, what is that line? And then where does like the threshold deviate for, the different levels?
Yeah. I always used to think that. And then when I started working with people that were qualifying for the CrossFit Games, it dawned on me that we do need to continue to try and get people as strong as possible within the confines of, a broader strength context.
Of the sport.
Of the sport.
For sure. Yeah.
And I think that's, especially for people that are now, there aren't probably a lot of people that are at the top of the sport that are listening to this podcast. They're probably training instead of listening to this podcast. But for them, it really is about, pushing the boundaries. Like we're going to give some, and I'll go ahead and do that.
Well,
now.
Let's start with if we're going to start with how strong do people need to be, the most common way that people would express strength or think about strength expression, or the most simplistic way, would probably be the power lifts and the Olympic lifts, right? Snatch, clean and jerk, and deadlift, back squat. There's bench press and strict press could be in there, but I think most people, if you're out there or if somebody reaches out to me and they're like, hey, I got to get stronger, those are probably that's their data set for how they define strength. So let's start with that most simplistic layer, and then we can kind of jump into why it's a little bit more complicated beyond that.
Yeah, so we pulled some data for the strength manual and for the coaching strength course. And what we tried to do is I tried to go in and see like what was the highest lift that someone who was a CrossFit Games athlete was able to hit in the various lifts. And some of these were pulled, like the deadlift, I've got 600 pounds. That was pulled for the males from, I want to say like the 2016 CrossFit Games when Dancer cleared the 600 pound deadlift ladder. He did that after running and after like a whole bunch of other barbells. So like in reality, he's probably stronger than that. And we know now, because this, I haven't updated this since Rogue, but we know now people are stronger than that. But
it's still pretty good. I mean, Chandler pulled 610. He was the only person that pulled there. They pulled it in a ladder format. So that means everybody that got up there was also pulling 5, 15, 25, 35, 45, like all the weight jumps in between there. But I think that's still a pretty good barometer for like, that's going to be about as strong as you're going to ever need to be to excel in the sport.
On the women's side, I think it was Brooke Wells had hit 415 on her back squat is what I had on her deadlift.
Yeah. And Alex Gazan pulled 425 at Rogue. So those numbers are still relevant today. But those are peak levels.
The other thing to think about is those have not improved dramatically over the course of what now 7 years. So the sport's advanced 7 years, and we've seen a 10-pound improvement at the top end of the power lift. So that tells you something.
But has the field caught up?
I was gonna say, I think the field as a whole though has closed the gap on that, because I think the average now is probably closer to 550 for guys.
For like the elite.
Yeah, for the elite guys. Yeah. I don't really know where the females are at necessarily with that.
I mean, watching at Rogue, it seemed there was a lot of people in the high threes.
I'd say Lauren pulled 380.
380.
Yeah, she matched her PR.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's probably about as high. I think some of it is that the last strength podcast that we did, we talked about the neural demand specifically of the deadlift and the power and the back squat. part of it is what we do and what we train for outside of it. And it's why we talked about the methods that you maybe find in a powerlifting context might not work as well for CrossFitters, because CrossFitters are doing all this other stuff. They're trying to get their 1RM slow lift stuff, but also their power lifts, their running, their gymnastics, and mixing it all together and handling a lot of training volume. So I think by nature of what our sport does, the ceiling on that relative to the world records will be a lot farther away from world records than we will see in the weightlifting movements.
Yeah. So to that point, the men's weights for,
should we do, that was elite. Should we do?
Yeah, I think we can get there. Let's go through some of the elite numbers, and then we'll talk about where, like, what's
we'll
some
backtrack to intermediate.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
cool.
On the back squat, it's about 500 pounds for men, and the best I was able to find in competition was a 330 pound back squat for women. I think that was Tia at.
Was it the CrossFit Total?
I think that was part of her CrossFit Total. I just was able to find a video of it.
That sounds low.
I agree with you. I think the female numbers are probably higher than that now, but that's still, it's an incredibly high number. And what I think is really interesting, to your point, you said the gap between elite CrossFitters and world records for powerlifting, the gap there is much bigger than it is for Olympic weightlifting. The gap for back squat to
a back squatter, a CrossFit Games back squat to a power lifter in an equal weight class, their 1 rep max back squat.
62% of a matched weight class. 198 is the weight class that we use for a raw back squat. So, and that's true across the board for back squat, deadlift, and bench press. It's between 60 and 68% of the strongest athletes in the world. And I think part of that is a result of where CrossFit puts their premium. They just don't test the power lifts as much as they test Olympic weightlifting. And I think part of it is just that, I think the specialization that's required to move an 804 pound back squat is just, it's so far beyond what a CrossFitter could do, the amount of time that they could dedicate it to.
Right. Or what's necessary for them.
Yeah. And
exactly.
fatigue, right?
Yeah.
Just like the amount of training we do.
Yeah. It would be, go ahead, Abner.
I was gonna say, what's the percentage difference on the Olympic lifts?
The Olympic lifts are closer to 80, and almost across the board, men and women are about 80% of the world record. So the highest numbers that we were able to get for CrossFit weightlifting for men was about 315 pounds for a snatch. Now, we had talked about this before the podcast. Yes, there are athletes who have snatched heavier than that at semifinals, but they were not individual games athletes that did that. And then the clean and jerk, I found a 395. And so those are 80 and 81% of the world records for the 196 weight class, which is a pretty comparable to the body weights of those athletes. And then on the female side, 205 snatch, which again, we talked about, we've seen heavier snatches than that, but that's what Tia won the snatch ladder in the games in 2021. So 2 years ago. So it's still really relevant. And then 270 pound clean and jerk, both of those are exactly 80% of the 156 weight class world records for women.
So weightlifting is much more of a premium. That's pretty obvious. If you go through every open, quarterfinals, CrossFit semifinal, Wadapalooza, Rogue, games, there's way more testing of snatch, clean and jerk in just the sport environment, which means there's always just a premium on training those specific qualities of strength. Now, I feel like that's maybe a misleading because we gave what the top people did,
right? And
you don't need to be that strong just to compete at an elite level. But those are basically what your targets would be from an elite perspective.
Yeah, I would say on at least on the men's side, maintaining a 450 pound back squat and a 550 pound deadlift, so about 50 pounds below the top level, is probably enough to be competitive at the true elite level. Yeah. And semifinals might even be just a little bit below that. I think you're for a good, like mid-pack semifinal athlete, you're going to have to be pretty close to that 450 pound back squat, maybe around 425, 435. But the deadlift, I think, has more variability.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think that there's numbers where it's like that you could pinpoint right now, and maybe you ballpark them now because I'm putting you on the spot, but there's numbers where it's like, if you can't hit this, I could just tell you right now, you can't even play the game.
So I would say
this is a good one.
I would say that Yeah, I would say there's numbers that if you can't hit them, that you won't make it. But I've also coached Jake Berman for like three semifinals where his max back squat was under, not at the first one, was under 400 pounds. And he was at semifinals and he was top 10. So like,
but not now.
He's also way stronger now.
And the sport also, I feel like, has potentially pushed that out.
Yeah.
That'd be interesting. I
was gonna say, it depends on what level you're also talking about, like what level of athlete and like where's their trajectory, because there is going to be.
Well, so far we've only talked about elites, so maybe just for elites.
So just like the going from.
I would say I'm gonna just pick male athletes because I've coached way more of them and I have more like empirical data in my head. I feel like with my women athletes, I generally have to cross-reference data more often because it's not like readily available. I would say right now, 245-pound snatch is probably like minimum,
absolute minimum
to be competitive at semifinals.
Yeah,
basically saying, so if I don't have that, you could already just look at me and be like, I don't care how good you are at everything else.
This has to be a huge priority for you.
We team coach Brooks Merkel on site, and he snatches 237,
something like that.
And he keeps in qualifiers. He will keep running up and finishing like 5 spots out of qualifying for things because the 1RM thing comes up and he just gets bumped out. And it happened to him in like 3 qualifiers in the offseason. And yes, I promise to anyone who might be wondering, we've prioritized strength. That used to be a 175.
And he's really good. He's got all the other spots, right?
Yeah. Yes. So good. Like he'll be top 3 in every other event, and then
and that's why I said minimum, because like if you're snatching that means you're winning gymnastics workouts, winning conditioning workouts to give yourself even a chance to be there.
Yeah.
So that'd be snatch. I'd say clean and jerk. Probably nowadays 315 pounds as a minimum.
Might be heavier than that.
Yeah, might be heavier, but I'd say
we're just ballparking here.
Yeah, if we're ballparking, that'd probably be a minimum. Back squat 400 pounds probably as a minimum threshold. Front squat 350-ish. I think deadlift you could get away with maybe like 475.
I don't think so anymore.
If it's not tested. Like if it's just cycling a deadlift, I'm saying like we're talking minimums. You're getting lucky and you're good at everything else.
If a deadlift 1RM shows up in quarterfinals and your deadlift 1RM is 475, you will not make it.
Probably.
I just think because of the number of people that will now qualify for quarterfinals, the dilution on that, you're going to be like 27,000th plate. Nah, that's probably an exaggeration.
There's not that many 500-pound deadlifters.
It's not going to be good.
Yeah. So I'd say those. And then strict press is an interesting one because I think from what I've seen, it's more so relative to your body weight. So I think if you have a 1-to-1 strict press to body weight ratio above 180 pounds or something, if you're under that, you probably need to strict press 180 anyways. But that one's harder because it's not tested as often, and I think it's more of a proxy for handstand push-ups than it is like you need this because it's not tested.
It was tested in age group as part of the total. I want to say that was in one of the years I did.
Oh, yeah. It was tested at the games, too.
Was that 2 years ago?
And if you think about it, if that's part of a total, it's such a...
the deadlift dilutes it, though.
Yeah, that's exactly. It's such a small number relative to the... Yeah, it's such a small number relative to the deadlift and the back squat that like they just get diluted by that.
All right, so we've done the elites. Everyone wants the elite numbers as kind of top lines. Can we pull that back open and do those same things for, we'll just call them intermediate athletes? Like this is more so you want to play the game at a more serious level. You want to make sure that you can get into quarterfinals. You want to be able to go to intermediate competitions at Wodapalooza or Fittest Experience or whatever competition that is around you. We've kind of created these as you can get into the top 10% when the quarterfinal threshold was 10%. But I think that's still just a good target for people. Like if you're going to be an intermediate athlete, you're never striving to be a CrossFit Games athlete, but you want to play the sport, you want to play it well, you want to be in the upper echelon, we'll give you kind of those same targets for weightlifting movements, powerlifting movements, and then we'll talk about a little bit of why those are misleading and it's not enough just to do that.
Yeah. So what we did in this was actually in the movement course, we did a needs analysis of kind of a quarterfinals level CrossFit athlete. So we used one of my clients, Tracy Tucker, who's a TTT coach,
TTT nutrition
coach. And we kind of used her as like a case study for that, to kind of walk through a needs analysis. And what we identified, the main things that we thought would be relevant were a snatch above 125 for women and above 185 for men. And I think that's probably required based on what we could expect. If you even just think back to this past year's open testing, they had that,
workout number 3.
Yeah, the handstand, push up, snatch.
155.
Yeah,
155 and then 185.
Yes, and we would not.
I think the second time it went through was 185. Yeah,
I meant for the females. It ended at 155.
Yeah,
so it was 125 to start, then 155.
Correct.
Yeah, it started lighter than that.
Well, there was 4 jumps, but
Yeah.
the last weight was 155.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it started.
The third bar was 125.
Yeah.
The men's we started at, I think, 95. It was like
Yes.
95, 135, 185, 225.
Oh yeah, I forgot. There's
And
4
so
jumps, not 2
having
jumps.
having the requisite strength to make it to the last bar and get a rep or 2 reps or 3 reps, not the second to last bar, to be clear. I would think is like the requisite strength level that would be
Agreed.
required
To get into quarterfinals.
and that's way more important than your back squat or your deadlift, because those are unlikely to be tested in the open, which is the qualifier for
the next level.
right. So from a clean and jerk perspective, we said 175 and 250 also for females and males, which I think is probably pretty accurate. They've done some clean ladders. It's been a while, but they've done some clean ladders in the open, and those weights would put you in a position that you'd be able to get to either the second to last barbell or, deep into the third barbell of those
The
ladders.
third to last barbell, though, in that format, there were 6 jumps, I feel
Yes.
like. So, there were 6 rounds or 5 rounds?
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
I think there were 6 and 17.3 and 5. But you'll notice that, so when we create top line data on elites, you go to the best of the best and you get your data. When you're looking at competing at this level, we go to the workouts that you have to do, figure out where the scores on those workouts need to be, and then you're backing into like, okay, well, then you need to be this strong just to play the game. You're not looking at, well, what's the data of all of the competitors that compete and what's the 90th percentile, because that's not as relevant, because maximal strength is not usually the icing on the cake, or is not the
limiter?
The limiter, yeah. It's not the limiter for giving you the score
Max
that's
is hungry.
required.
He likes cake.
Yeah.
We just
All
ate
I had
cake.
was chicken for lunch. I didn't get a cookie. I got a sweet tooth.
Oh, I brought monster cookies too. Should have given you one.
Yeah.
I think that's such a good point, is you really need to look at what weights are required to play the game if you're trying to look at qualifying for quarterfinals versus if you're trying to compete at the highest level. It's what does it take to win? And I think those are 2 separate conversations.
I feel like I start sounding like a broken record here when I jump in and make a comment like this. But how often, or what percentage of athletes out there right now who are in that level that you're talking about do you think actually know this?
I think it's
Or
pretty
pay
small.
attention to it?
I was saying none.
No, not none.
Dude, it's one of the first questions
Yeah,
that
maybe.
when and I haven't onboarded a new client in a while, but when I onboard a new client, one of the first questions they ask is like, how strong do I need to be to compete at the level I want to compete at? And I think most people probably have like some very fuzzy concept of how strong they need to be, but they don't have the ability to put numbers on it like this.
I think they ask the question a lot, but I don't think they know how to figure out the answer to the question.
And I think an even more important question for athletes like this, and even athletes at the top level, is once I get these strength levels, does that guarantee that I'm going to be able to, to qualify for the
Right.
next stage? And like most of the time, the answer is, again, very complicated. Like there's layers to that answer. If you're someone like a Brooks who is finishing in the top 5 in most of the other workouts, then the answer is yes. If you get this strong, you will qualify for what you're trying to qualify for. But I think for the most part, for almost everybody else, there's so many other things that they have to get better at as well, that just getting to these strength metrics doesn't guarantee that you're going to be able to express these strength metrics when it's combined with 100 toes to bar, or, you know what I mean? When it gets mixed into some kind of CrossFit workout that
Right.
confounds your ability to express the strength that you spent all that time building in isolation.
Yeah. I want to talk about what other strength qualities you might need, because I think strength experts, and I feel like mindsets evolve. And in coaching and CrossFit, I think the first step of the evolution from like pure randomness was people like Rudy Nielsen at Outlaw back in the day, or, Catalyst type thing, get in, move well, snatch well, clean and jerk well, get these numbers up. And then when they're higher, you'll be using a lower percentage of your 1 rep max. So therefore you'll be better. So there was this pure strength as the primary target. Now, just off the bat, it's kind of wrong, because then Olympic weightlifters would come in and they'd all be setting the records on something like Grace, which is just, or Isabel, which is just like pure 30 reps for time. Then the strongest person would win every time. But very early on into training, you realize like, oh, that's not the case. Like, there's a threshold of strength you need to get to. And if you're trying to be great at the sport, you need to keep trying to drive it up as long as you can. But there's other variables of strength endurance or gymnastics pairing with these things, or ability to express that strength when you're tired, that need to be taken into consideration as well.
Excuse me, you broke that concept when you created the battery test, right? Where you had someone build to a 1RM power clean and then do, I don't remember if it was 30 for time or if it was a time frame.
Yeah, I think the original time that we did, I think we talked a little bit about this on the OPT podcast, but I was seeing this. I was getting people stronger. At the time, I was pretty strong relative to the field of CrossFitters, but I was getting crushed in barbell cycling.
What year is this?
This was 2011. So I had competed in regionals in 2011, games on a team in 2010. Then I kind of stepped out of competing and went into coaching, but I still had maintained a lot of strength. And I was like, why is it that I could power clean 30 more pounds than this person, but if we got to do 10 of them at 225, I'm blown up and I can't keep going, and they're able to do it. So I started to collect data to say, okay, let's build people up to a 1RM. I think the test that we originally used was 8-minute AMRAP at 90%.
Yeah, that sounds
which
right.
was long enough, and it was super grindy, and I think it was probably too many to, like, if we're just trying to collect data, it's probably too long to do it.
So it'd be like 8-minute AMRAP of snatches at 80%?
At 90%.
90%.
Yeah.
That sounds terrible.
We also created another test that was kind of based on Josh Bridges' numbers, because he was one of the people I was watching. Back then, I think he snatched like 245 or something. He was on the lower end of the spectrum. I had, within a couple months of CrossFit, I think I snatched 285, but I watched a video of him snatching 20 reps for time at 185, and it was like less than 2 minutes. He was doing like 10 reps a minute. And that, just at the same weight, even though it was a way lower percentage for me, was crushing me. So I started collecting data on that. Like, okay, well, let's build people up to a 1RM and then do 20 for time at 80%. We did a back squat test or a front squat test where you build to a max, then you fix a tempo at a certain percentage and have them do a certain number of reps, which was called like a neuromuscular efficiency test.
Yes, I remember this.
So we had all of these data points that we were collecting that were indicating like, oh, max strength is not what's separating the best of the best in this. Like, the best of the best are still strong, but it's more their strength endurance profile and how they're able to cycle weights and their strength endurance in gymnastics that's really separating and making them great athletes.
So it might be something that boils down like this. Like, if you're, let's say you're a male athlete and you back squat 315, which we know is way under what we had said is required to be competitive, and you do some absolute strength work and drive your 1RM up to 375. That would be a probably multi-year project for most people, but let's just say that's what you've done. Your ability to cycle 225 probably improved, right? Now, let's say you're that same athlete and you go from that 375 to 400 in, you invested multiple years to drive 25 pounds onto your 1RM, because that's what would be required at that point. There wouldn't be that much of an improvement in your ability to cycle, to do high volumes at 225, because the early adaptation, you're like actually creating a big gap between your 1RM and the weight that you're trying to cycle. But later on, it's like the gap between your 1RM.
Yeah, you're changing it 3%. Like, it's going from 80% to 78% of your 1 rep max.
I feel like that mistake is made in training so much, where people, they're like, if I just get my 1RMs up, then I'll be able to handle the heavier barbells in the sport. And it's like, yeah, that might be true. Like, you might actually need to get your 1RMs up, but we just gave you numbers that you can compare to, to the field. And if your numbers are pretty close to that, but you still are terrible at cycling barbells, well, then you probably don't need to be spending time doing 1RM work. You probably need to be spending time working on like a power endurance category, like like weightlifting battery or something like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's phases of development or almost periodization for the sport. Like if you look at the compete program and you look at an off-season block of training, you see a lot more foundational strength work. We're going to test PRs. We're going to run progressions on overhead squat, front squat, try to drive PRs up. I just went through and I looked at the upcoming cycle getting ready for the Open. You still see some of that, but you see way more barbell cycling, like 5 reps as fast as possible, rest 2 minutes, repeat, or putting things in more interval and CrossFit settings like 10 muscle ups, rest 10 seconds, and then 5 snatches for time at 80% of your 1 rep max, rest and repeat. Or the simple way is to just put them in Metcons. But I think we've made it clear over time, just as an organization, that we think there's a little bit of a separation between training to be good at a sport and practicing and playing the sport. So generally speaking, there will be Metcons in there, but the strength profile kind of changes. So that happens on a macro yearly planning cycle, but also in your career as an athlete, you got to spend time in the early times getting yourself strong enough, like hitting some of these minimum thresholds, which generally means less conditioning, less total volume, more food, maybe allowing yourself to gain a little bit of weight and hypertrophy to get big. Then once you get to those minimums, now priorities shift and balance a little bit. It's like, okay, well, you're still trying to get stronger, but now you're strong enough that you also need to get fit with your strength at the same time, doing some of those other advanced training methods.
Sorry, I started talking to Travis about the music being loud as hell out there. And did we end up saying for that?
You left?
Yeah,
He
he
walked
walked out
out
a second. You were in.
I was in the
train of
zone.
thought. Yeah,
For that intermediate level athlete, did we give all? I know y'all kind of fumbled through that quarterfinal workout.
We
trying to figure out that bar. But
we
go
gave
through all the numbers.
Yeah, we gave numbers for both the snatch and clean and jerk, which I think we all agree are like the metrics.
Did you want to finish other metrics? Or,
I mean,
or were there any more?
We have a deadlift in here, but given that a deadlift ladder has not been tested since 2014, I believe, was when the deadlift ladder in.
You mean the deadlift box jump?
Yes.
No, I think there was one later where there was deadlift handstand walk. That was ended at 315.
But it wasn't a ladder, right? The other one, I think, ended at like 365. So we basically said that your deadlift 1RM probably needs to be around 255 for women and 365 for men. But I think that's way in terms of order of importance. I think the snatch and clean and jerk are way more important at that quarterfinals level than your deadlift. Now, having a requisite amount of strength in a deadlift and a back squat are required to build a clean and jerk at 175 and 250 and to build a snatch at 125, 185. They're just not the things that I would measure to determine whether you're going to be able to qualify for quarterfinals.
Yeah, I think I might disagree, or at least say that they're just as important to train, but maybe a little bit more skewed right off the bat to endurance, because it seems like when deadlift comes out in a CrossFit setting, it's like 225-pound deadlifts, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which, by the way, was the worst workout ever. Chris had filmed me and like made a little meme of me dead afterwards, and Perrin died, and I beat her on that workout, and she repeated it like 4 times, so I'll never forget that pain. But I think for the slow lifts, it's more your ability to cycle the barbell earlier in the sport, because that gets tested way more often with the slow lifts, which kind of comes back to the whole methods thing we talked about earlier, is that you have people teaching methods to drive up 1RM deadlift, 1RM back squat, which are good and you need. However, having methods to improve a 10RM deadlift or the ability to do 50 deadlifts for time at 315, those metrics are way more important for development of the sport, and they need to be trained a little bit differently. You can use some of the methods we talked about in the other video, like isometrics can be good for building time under tension, but there are other methods like weightlifting battery work or intervals where you're doing, EMOMs and stuff like that to build strength endurance that are more beneficial for you.
One of the ones we talked about in the course is pre-fatigue, right? So using something like a 500-meter row into repeated deadlifts is a great way to start. You said, you know, there's a difference between, I think you said something along the lines of like practicing the sport and training for the sport. And that is part of training for the sport, right? So doing intervals of 500-meter row at a pretty hard effort into 15 deadlift at 225, rest 2 minutes times 4 sets. You know, you're accumulating 60 deadlift at a relatively heavy weight, and you're getting 2K of rowing in. That's relatively sport specific, but it's not the sport. It's not practicing the sport per se.
Okay, so for like an intermediate athlete trying to go into quarterfinals, like what is like the threshold for them to try to figure out like when they start to try to change their training? Like they start going from like the 1RMs into more of like the strength endurance aspect? Because I don't think we've really talked about that. We talked about like what the minimums were, but I'm assuming if you're competing in the sport, you still have a thought process of trying to take this sport further down the road. So like, do they kind of like 1RMs go, and do they start like biasing training more towards strength endurance, or do they try to hold on to some of that, like what the compete program does? Like, what is it? What's that look like?
I think that's really context and goal dependent, right? So using Brooks as an example, you know, when he first came on board with you and I, what is it, probably 2.5 years ago now?
Something like that.
He was very clear, like, he wanted to compete in the sport, but he wanted to be able to qualify for semifinals at some point. Like he really, like that's what he expressed to us. And so we have kept the focus on building absolute strength and building up those strength numbers at the detriment of, you know, building
conditioning keep coming up or those things.
Yeah. And that was the route we took. And there have been a couple times that if you think about it, we deviated just a little bit for like the first time he qualified for Wadapalooza. Like we deviated a little bit to make sure he was prepped for the volume of Wadapalooza.
Yeah.
And then,
well, I mean, even with his deadlift cycle, we changed it to like a strength endurance. It was like bench press and deadlifting, a strength endurance piece. And then he ended up actually PRing his deadlift anyway.
Yes.
So it worked for him. I was just curious, like if there was like a rule of thumb that you guys thought about.
The working with an individual is much different than writing a training program as a base framework for a group of people that are following it. When you have a group of people that are following it, you have to make an estimation of what is the average or the median of this group of people and what do they need to prepare. Most people that are in compete need well-rounded development in everything, with a little bit more of a skew in the intermediate, I would say, for skill development and overall strength. In the RX, I would say a little bit more of a skew towards strength and just general development in everything. And the elite, I think it's just in the volume tolerance and just continuing to get better at every component of things.
Doing more of the sport-specific work that Kyle had talked about.
Yeah. So when we do that and we have an annual structure, you're basically just layering in phases of development at each time of the year. So it's like, okay, now is more base strength training in the off season. And then as we get closer to, you know, let's say winter is coming, which is a little bit deeper than halfway into the year, you start to shift into like more interval work and more advanced training strength endurance metrics. And then as you get close to the season, you start to do more sport specific stuff, and you run through a developmental cycle all year round that's building all three of those things together. And you're kind of like juggling strength and endurance together and trying to make sure every year you're a little bit better in both. When you're working with an individual athlete and working with them and writing them a one-on-one program, even if they're following part of compete as part of their training, that's when you sit down and do a needs analysis and initial consultation.
Yeah, so the first stage of that is really getting a sense of where the individual wants to go. And I think that's also true. The individual has to do that if they're part of compete. They need to know, like, all right, I need more strength development, so I need to go into the RX group because that's more strength focused on the off season. Or I'm an advanced athlete. I have the strength metrics that are required, but I have trouble expressing them in the sport. Well, you should probably go into elite. With that being said, the flow is essentially just like first off, understanding.
Hold on, big red flag there.
Yeah.
Do you think most people know how to self-assess that, or did you just open up a can of worms?
I literally was just thinking of that.
Yeah. I think we gave them some of the context in this podcast right here.
Well, and also in our program, the way we try to solve that, I don't know if most people can self-select that, but Brandon,
because most people, would you say overestimate or underestimate?
Yeah.
Well,
I think most people's self-assessment, myself included, I've been doing this for a very long time. It's very hard to self-reflect without bias because you're like in your own shit all the time, right? Like you can't get perspective away from you. So we solve that in compete. with trying to have Brandon and Mia be the proxies for asking questions. In the water cooler, we reach out when people sign up and try to help them deviate to the right thing.
And that's also the purpose of the cycle overviews and things like that. So people can understand, like, hey, this is a strength focused cycle.
This is what we're working on.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think it is very important for people to really pay attention to those, because then they can get the most out of the program.
Yeah. We talked about intention in the last podcast we just did, how important it is for plyometrics. That could be zoomed out. It's like the intention of your training and what you do with your day-to-day training, I think, will help you get the right things out of you.
And just for reference, we keep saying that last podcast. The last podcast we're talking about, it was called The 3 Methods Most Overlooked in CrossFit. And in that episode, y'all brought up those 3 methods, and we actually gave pieces of our strength course away for free if you go to the link that's on that page, and we'll even put it in this one too, and you'll get tell them what they'll get, Kyle.
Get a new car.
Yeah, that would be sick. I would definitely like a new car.
Never mind, we don't have to go that long. It's just basically 3 free pieces of the course that talk about those methods in that episode. But
watch that episode.
That's like the 8th time we've said the previous episode.
Oh yeah,
so
but
just
it might
so they
not
know,
be the episode before this one. Yeah, I didn't think about that.
So anyway, talking about individual clients, I think that's really the process. Understand the person, understand who they are, where they want to go. One of the things I do, and we talked about this in the strength course, is really try and get a sense of their own self-assessment of their perceived strengths and weaknesses. Now, whether or not I actually use that to guide their training, a lot of that has to do with how experienced they are. If there's someone who's been in the sport for 10 years, I'm probably going to listen to it. If it is someone who just transitioned out of Division I swimming 3 months before, Brooks, I might not listen to it as closely, because I might look at it and be like, yeah, like, yes, your rowing is not good, but really you just have terrible rowing technique. We're going to fix that, and you're going to be an elite rower, elite CrossFit rower. And that was the case. So once you've done that initial assessment, then you have to go through and do like an actual physical assessment with them. You have to take them out onto the floor, and you run a movement screen, which we've got an entire course covering how to kind of do the movement analysis and movement screen. And then you go through an actual process of testing their 1RMs, of going in and figuring out where are their metrics relative to the data that we've got for where they want to compete. In Brooks's case, his metrics were really, really far away from where he needed to be to compete. In fact, I had them pulled up, but my computer has since turned off. But I think his back squat 3RM at the time was 315. And we were just talking about the fact that, you need to be around 400 pounds as a minimum to be able to qualify for what he wanted to. So that right there just tells us that he's looking at, for a 1RM, probably a 75-pound deficit from where he wanted to go.
Yeah, I think it was a 175 snatch too. I feel like that number is in my head. It might be wrong, but
I think it's 175 or 177.
Something like that. He was so technically limited, though. It wasn't like a strength problem in that particular lift.
Yeah. In his clean, it was a strength problem.
Hey, Kyle, can we try this? Let's say I send you an email, or did you have something?
Well, I was going to say, like, we were talking about how strong do you have to be for CrossFit. Like, that's kind of like the basis of this podcast. And it's like, when you do an assessment, how do you just start to determine how strong someone needs to be? Like, obviously we have some numbers that you can look at, and then we can go back to some of the previous tests. We can be like, okay, well, these are the minimums that you need to do. So when you assess someone on the floor, are you going through 1RMs? Are you doing power endurance, or like strength endurance repeat tests? Like, how does that look like, and how do we structure that?
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. We're in line here, Kyle. Then what I was going to say is, I send you an email, Kyle. I've been doing CrossFit for a while, and I want to hire you as a coach. And I say, hey man, I've been knocking at the door of, the top 10% or the top 3% of quarterfinals for a while, and I'm really trying to push into semifinals. What do you and knowing nothing about me, and let's say I come on site, what are we testing?
Well, I think if you're that experienced, the first thing I'm going to do is ask you for your most recent 1RMs, because there's not going to be any need to go in and test those if you have your own data from the past year. Why would we go in and repeat those and just capture information that we already know? Sure. I'm going to be doing much more of a in-person technical assessment. I want to look at snatch technique. I want to look at clean and jerk technique. And then we're going to start to, at that level, we're going to take past quarterfinals tests, and we're going to rerun some of those tests. And we're going to look at, tests from the past 3 years that involve heavy barbell cycling. Like we've talked about with regards to strength, I think it was quarterfinals 3 from 2023. That's, the burpee box jump over clean and jerk workout. You're going to test that, because that's going to tell me a lot about your expression of strength in the sport. And, do you may have the metrics, you may have a 335 power clean and jerk, but you are switching to squat, clean and jerk on the third round of that when you're on the set of, like the set of 3 or whatever whatever it is. Like, that's going to tell me more about what we need to do than just getting your 1RMs when you come in to test.
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer this question succinctly, but the goal whenever you go through an initial consult. So the reason we called it coaching strength is because it's not just strength training program design. It can never just be data driven. We're giving
the course.
The course. Yeah, sorry. The course is called coaching strength. The reason why is because the data doesn't tell you the whole story. Like in that example, we know, okay, Brooks's snatch is 175. That's not good enough. Okay, well, what do we need to do then to make the change? You don't just have an easy answer to that. It is a combination of you having an understanding of movement that's good enough that you can do a proper technical evaluation. So in the strength course, we called that the technical analysis, where you get some KPIs of where their movement is, how it operates.
What's the KPI?
KPI are key performance
I was
indicators.
going to say, this man about to just drop KPI on everybody.
Key performance indicators. It's a phrase used in PT and also in business development. Like, these are things that you need to be able to hit to be able to perform. So they're key performance indicators. Like, they're major keys for
an
what
example.
you need to do.
An example of that would be like in a snatch is someone in their
not
setup.
letting your hip rise up right off the bat and being able to maintain your back angle. So you need to go through some of that technical analysis. You need to get some PRs. When were those PRs hit? You need to compare PRs. Like, some people, you'll watch their video and you'll be like, oh, wow, your technique's really good. Why aren't you stronger? Then you look at their snatch relative to their back squat, and their back squat is so low that they're snatching right on top of their back squat. And it's like, oh, you could do weightlifting progressions until you're blue in the face, but like, you're already technically crisp and you're not going to get it any heavier unless you build your back squat and you build your overhead squat. So that part, I think, is the art of coaching. It's being able to have some level of experience, having gone through reps, having compared athletes, having leaned on other mentors in the sport to be able to make informed, critically thought out decisions and be able to interact with your athletes. Because I have athletes, for example, that are like, I want to get stronger. And I'm in my head like, you're already strong enough to make semifinals. You need to get fitter. But they want to get stronger. And their metric of success is seeing their snatch go up and seeing their clean go up. So I prioritize it, even though I don't think it is their top priority. So I have to balance it with other priorities. So to me, answering that question is almost impossible. It's like, this is what your goal of being a coach is, being able to go through that analysis and make good subjective decisions based on all of the inputs, data-wise, human, their thoughts, their experience, what their training's like, how much they want to compete, whether they're competing to like really be a competitor or they just fucking love the lifestyle. Like, all those things, I think, weigh into how you make your decision to prioritize strength or strength endurance or sport performance.
So the way you describe that sounds really complex, but one of the things that we did in the course is we laid out the system that we use to actually go through that assessment process, starting with the consultation, how to actually do that, how to learn about the individual. Like you had talked about, the movement screen, just making sure that they're safe and that they can move. The technical analysis, making sure that they, like Habdo said, like Brooks's technique was not even remotely close to where it needed to be for him to snatch heavier. Then running a base strength analysis. Well, we knew his
needs analysis too.
The needs analysis
before
on
that, right?
Yes, the needs analysis in the sport already happened in that initial consultation. And then, a base strength analysis, which tells us where's their back squat, where's their deadlift, where are their actual absolute strength metrics. Then we talked about combo strength, which is a little more complicated. I don't want to get into the topic.
Well, let's
of
just
combo
say strength endurance, like the battery, the power clean,
strength endurance.
Yeah, doing the power clean test and seeing, can they cycle the barbell well.
But it wouldn't make any sense for you to do that test prior to knowing what someone's 1RM back squat would be. Like, you wouldn't do
that. Wouldn't be first.
Repeat front squats before you've done a front squat to figure out where it is, right? So that's next. And then finally sport specific testing, which is what I had said. If someone came to me and they were
at that
top
level,
3%, that would be where I would start, because I would already have all the other information, right? But that's literally the process. And when you're done with that, you have this priority list. You know, all right, in Brooks's case, snatch tech, that's a huge red flag, not a red flag, but that's a huge priority. Back squat strength, it's 315, needs to be 400, huge priority. Deadlift strength, it's 375, needs to be, what did we say?
550. Yeah.
This needs to go up. I just deadlifted 500 though. So, I mean,
pretty close to it, I think.
Yeah, it was either 495 or 500. I can't remember. Yeah. Anyway, you start to create this priority list. And from the priority list, what we talked about in the previous podcast is that we had, in the course, we laid out all these methods for getting people stronger. You literally can connect the dot from your priority list to a method. He needs to improve his technique. We'll use technical training. He needs to improve his 1RM back squat. We use strength methods. He needs to improve his deadlift repeatability, his deadlift strength endurance. We use strength endurance methods. Like, you literally can connect the dots. And that's what we tried to create, a process for people to be able to follow, to take someone and actually get them stronger. Yeah. That's what we tried to create.
Yeah. And then the process too of guiding them through that, because I think it's easy to like look at this data and be like, oh, you got to get your snatch better, and we're going to give you these snatch progressions to get better. And after 3 weeks, somebody gets tendonitis in their knees, or they get tired, or, they have a life event happen. And that is the art of coaching them through the process, holding accountability, backing off, deloads. When do you progress? When do you test? So that process, to give a quick answer, I think is just, it's too hard. That's literally what the course was to do, was like, you're trying to build these, I'm going to go back to the cake. You're trying to build these strength cakes. We gave you a baking recipe for how to build athlete cakes that are getting stronger. So the worst metaphor ever.
So having heard all that, how strong do I need to be to CrossFit?
And we're back to the beginning.
Stronger than you are right now.
Yeah. I think the intermediate values that we created are a really good starting point for just qualifying through to competitions, to start gaining real competition experience. At the elite level, it's too hard to really give concrete, this is the number that you have to hit, because it is very dependent upon how good you are at enduring that strength, how good your gymnastics are. These also are simple strength tests. There's also like strict handstand push-ups for max reps, unbroken. That's like a strength endurance test, but it's probably one of the most important types of things. Or how many muscle ups can you do unbroken? Those are gymnastics tests, but they're also actually types of strength qualities that you need to have.
In the course, we have a case study of Alexis where Adam goes through her sport-specific assessment, and you can see how much more complex it is trying to run an assessment for a truly elite athlete than it is for someone who just needs to get their snatch and back squat up. It's like the layers of complexity in that.
Alexis Raptis, the sixth fittest woman in the world?
Yes, that one.
That same one.
That same one.
Who was outside wearing elf costumes with Travis.
So maybe a better question than, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Maybe a better question than, the joke I just had of how strong you
which
need
was
to be.
supposed to be the title of this.
Is that what I should be worrying about right now?
Yeah, it does pose an interesting... Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, it kind of depends on the level of athlete and the trajectory that you're trying to travel here. Like, in order to go to quarterfinals, I don't know if, like, having maximal strength levels matters that much. Now, if they come out with, like, the clean and jerk test or the power snatch test that they've done like twice now, where it's like the 30, 20, 10 and the 10 power snatches at the end at 185, whatever. Like, you need some minimal strength in order to move the barbell, but like there's so many other components of the sport that I don't know if maximal strength levels matter that much for that athlete. You got to be strong, but it doesn't matter that much for the people trying to go to semifinals and then trying to make the jump to the elite level. You have to be strong, and then you have to be also enduring, and then you also need to be able to put that into a sports specific context where you're probably really, really tired, and then you still have to be strong. But what I was thinking about also on top of that was for Alexis in her case study, they actually used that test that we've been talking about, the clean and jerk test from quarterfinals, as like a progression to build her power clean strength and strength endurance and then retest that. Well, I watched her do it at quarterfinals, and then I watched her do her retest, and she smashed the living hell out of that workout. It was like a completely different person. It was wild watching how much stronger that she got and how much more enduring, how quickly she was able to get back on the barbell, it was super impressive.
Yeah, we did that, or Chris did that in her, I think it was a Day of Life video that came out right before the games. She did the back 9.
Oh, from the games.
Yeah, she did the games, and he ran progressions on that and redid that.
She smashed that one, too.
At the tail end of that video, you could see her games performance side by side with just that day she ended up retesting in the gym.
Yeah. So to answer your question outright, yes, I think people...
Rephrase the question because it's been a minute.
So the question is, are people focusing too much on strength?
Or is that the thing to focus on? Yeah, pretty much.
I think I would say it's not the only thing to focus on, and especially as you're getting ready for the season. Now, I'm going to caveat that because I think being strong is probably one of the best things that you can do for longevity, health, and GPP training. So I think everybody should try to get as strong as they can within the context of building their well-rounded fitness. But I think that sport performance and development of the skills that you have in the sport will actually pay people more dividends than just focusing on strength. So I know a ton of athletes who are like, oh my God, I got to get my snatch up. And I'm like, well, you snatch, let's just say it's 225. Like, all right, your 225 snatch is way higher as a data point relative to where it needs to be than how many double unders you can do unbroken, or how far you can handstand walk in 3 minutes, or how many strict handstand push-ups you can do, or what your pistol quality is like and how you can do them and stay balanced. So I think that there needs to be some level of base focus, and there's always in every training program we write, from compete all the way to the individual, there's always a focus on strength. But I do think athletes get too overly hyped and too overly focused on getting that freaking IG PR on that strength thing.
The barbell's just so much sexier than how many double unders you can do unbroken.
Yeah,
but let's just face it. That's the uphill battle that things like max distance handstand walk in 3 minutes, and they're harder to define. Like, people don't have, it's so clear that when you watch someone lift more weight than you, that they're stronger than you. But it's so hard to find that kind of data. Like, how far should someone be able to walk in 3 minutes on their hands? Like, how far should someone in this sport at the, quarterfinals level be able to walk in 3 minutes?
I mean, I think that's the value of coaching and having a coach to be able to walk you through that process. But to just answer the question, and like, yes, I get that it's sexy, but the leaderboard doesn't give a shit how sexy something is. Like, there's 5 tests, and 1 or 2 of them is going to express your peak strength. The rest of them are going to be skills and endurance and conditioning. So it comes down to athletes being really self-aware about what they really want. That's something that Chris brings up a lot. Like, how much do people, you were going to bring it up?
Yes.
Yeah. He always asks the question, like, how much do people like really want to compete and be competitive versus enjoy what they're doing and just be like in the mix with people that are competitive?
Can I say it the way I normally do?
Yeah.
It's like, because
that's not what I said.
Well, no, you're on it. But to really clear that up is that there's people who want to compete and they're going to compete. And then there's this other group of people who want to do the kind of workouts that competitors do. You see what I'm saying? So there's this little breed of people out there who just like doing what competitors do, but they don't really care about the going and doing the competing part. And I think a lot of shit gets weird when you don't admit that.
Yeah. There's also a in between that where there are recreational athletes that really enjoy trying to train like professionals. And I think, like, I don't have the time, I know, to dedicate like that, but when I do go and practice golf or go to jiu-jitsu, or even when I do CrossFit, I really want to be intentional about getting better and what each thing is like and how I would practice it. And I know I'm not ever going to hit a ball like Tiger Woods or hit a snatch like Matt Frazier or do those types of pro things, but I have a recreational athlete mindset where I strive to act like a professional in terms of my intention. Because that's my version of fun. It engages my head.
We need to figure out how to talk about that.
Well, look, in the case of your example and your example, there is no strength that you need to be in those examples. And I think that's maybe where this whole thing kind of like falls apart, is that if you're someone who just wants to train like the elite, you don't have to hit any strength metrics. There's no need to be this strong. Just get as strong as you want.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Just do strength work.
Just do strength work.
Yeah.
It's less of a, like what we talked about this entire podcast is using strength training as a means to an end, right? We are doing strength training to get someone stronger to compete in a sport, and we know what those metrics are. But if you just want to come out and train, just do strength training. Do well structured, varied, not constantly varied, but
varied, enough variation.
Varied strength training so that you can actively get stronger, avoid overuse injuries, and you can have fun training like you're a pro.
Amen.
Mic drop.
Yeah, that was a freaking headset
Actually,
slam.
let's do this. If you made it
drop.
this far into the podcast, it would be interesting if you guys want to jump in the comments and put any questions you might have, and maybe we could circle up and do an episode where we're just answering questions.
Yeah.
Follow-up
Yeah, those are
questions.
fun.
If we get enough. If
Yeah.
we don't, then screw you guys. We're going home.
Does that conclude everything that we wanted to talk about?
Oh, we're circling back now?
No, I just didn't know. I mean, I guess we
think
can
so.
headset slam.
Did we conclude the topic there?
Yeah, I did when I broke my
Think about it. Hold on. Let's do a real deep think.
Yeah.
Anything else y'all want to
I mean,
say?
my thought was we originally started and we talked that the concept was going to be how strong you need to be to compete in CrossFit. We gave the minimum standards for being an intermediate, which I think that fairly and accurately gave them some numbers and targets to get after. We gave elite targets, which are like you keep striving for them if you're competing in the sport. You just keep trying to drive them up and up and up in every category until you're close to the top in every one. So I think that covers the whole spectrum of people that are more towards the either recreational competitors or real competitors. And then we kind of concluded with that last group of people who I think of more as GPP trainees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just your version of GPP
Is doing
is
CrossFit.
fun, hard, competitive CrossFit. It's not recreational triathlons or pick up frisbee golf or whatever other games there are. It's just you like playing
or just
CrossFit.
doing regular CrossFit that's not tailored towards that.
Yeah,
To
yeah.
my, at least in the analogy I was trying to make, like you'll lose them by just being like, this is GPP CrossFit. No, they're that person, but they want to do the.
Yeah. They just want to do a little bit more competitive training. Yeah, so I think we covered that. An hour deep on the money.
Easy.
We crushed it.
All right. Put
All
any
right,
questions you have down below, and go check out that link if you want to 3 free sections of the strength course.
Yes. Bye. Oh.